Even Mrs. Roosevelt, as compassionate as she seemed, nevertheless, there was a question mark in my mind. And I was not an Eleanor Roosevelt fan at that time. She, in a sense, this may sound kind of presumptuous, but she had to prove her way every step with my kind of young Negro militant. And any slip, we were right there to criticize her.
Welcome to Archival. I am your host, Juanita Tolliver. Today's journey into sisterhood threw me for a loop. I'll be honest, it was an emotional process exploring the dynamic between two people I never knew were friends or even acquaintances. I'm talking about civil rights activist, legal scholar, poet, LGBTQ icon, and Episcopal priest, Dr. Reverend Pauli Murray, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. When I learned about their friendship, my immediate response was, how did these two meet? Why were they friends? And what prompted them to remain friends? Was there an unequivocal power dynamic between them? And again, how? Here you have a young person and organizer who was figuring out life and themselves, casually corresponding with a sitting First Lady of the United States. A First Lady with a well-known penchant for power moves and statesmanship. And I assume that there were bound to be imbalances in their interactions. Does this make me cynical? Maybe, sure, just a little bit. But this second episode on sisterhood reminded me that it can still be complex, complicated, and compassionate. Murray and Roosevelt's friendship spanned decades, with different stages that transitioned from confrontation via typewriter as acquaintances to coordinated advocacy as associates, and then to friendship. This is where the phrase slow burner flashed in my mind like a neon sign from Love Island. For this episode, I was able to review the correspondence between Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt featured in the FDR Presidential Library archives, interviews and audio files from the Schlesinger Library, articles from Ebony Magazine archives, Pauli Murray's memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, and Patricia Bell Scott's fabulous book exploring their friendship, The Firebrand and the First Lady. Through my research, I learned that Murray and Roosevelt were a pair of people who effectively served as unofficial advisors to each other and conduits for each other, and their dynamic was mutually beneficial through the years. Please take note that I use the word people intentionally here instead of women, because Pauli Murray used he and she pronouns interchangeably with friends and family and sought out gender-affirming care throughout their life, requesting testosterone and hormone therapy. According to the Pauli Murray Center, it is unclear which pronouns Murray would use today, so for this episode, you will hear me refer to Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray with they, them pronouns throughout. This is Archival. It all started at camp. The first time that Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray encountered each other was at Camp Terra in upstate New York in 1934. Camp Terra was part of the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, and it was a women-specific New Deal workforce development program that the First Lady fought to launch after visiting some of the male-focused CCC camps, the Civilian Conservation Corps. These camps were for unemployed people, and Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to ensure that the needs of women who experienced financial struggles and unemployment during the Great Depression were met just like the needs of men in the same predicament. Pauli Murray applied to Camp Terra after a health scare due to malnutrition after working as a field representative and traveling salesperson for Opportunity Magazine, a publication of the National Urban League. This was Murray's first job after graduating from Hunter College in January 1933, at a time when millions upon millions were unemployed. And while Murray was grateful to have a job, all of the work travel ran them ragged to the point that their doctor warned that they were at risk for developing tuberculosis. The prescription was rest, specifically in Florida, according to Pauli Murray's memoir. But in the midst of the Great Depression, Murray couldn't afford that. As an alternative, the doctor recommended Camp Terra, where fresh air in upstate New York, a less strenuous schedule, and 3 guaranteed meals per day would be the perfect place for Murray to rest and recover. As First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt drove her convertible coupe up to the camp's entrance in 1934, Pauli Murray rushed past the other campers to go back to their bunk, change their shirt, and wash their face for the occasion. But when Roosevelt walked past the campers in the main hall, Murray made an attempt to hide in plain sight. In their memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, they wrote, quote, "When the party came through the long corridor of the common hall where several of us were seated, I felt that tremor of excitement I was to experience many times later when coming into Mrs. Roosevelt's presence. I dropped my eyes and pretended to read a newspaper to keep from staring as she passed." Apparently, the camp director saw Murray's lack of engagement with the First Lady and considered it to be a sign of disrespect. The director even accused them of as much face-to-face after Roosevelt left the camp. Murray thought that was a ridiculous statement, writing in their memoir, quote, "The charge seemed ridiculous. We were not being introduced, and I thought I was doing the proper thing by making myself as inconspicuous as I could." Pauli Murray even acknowledged the non-interaction in their first letter to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1938. More on that in just a minute.
I will see something that needs to be done. Others will see exactly the same thing, have the exact same reaction, but they are not pushed to take a step.
Yeah.
But I can't stand the pressure, and I must do something about it to relieve myself. I must take something, take some action, do something, write a letter.
In December 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt showered praise on the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as he was awarded an honorary doctorate degree. President Roosevelt told the UNC students and administrators, quote, "I am happy and proud to become an alumnus of the University of North Carolina, typifying as it does American liberal thought through American action." And that he believed that UNC was representative of, quote, "liberal teaching and liberal thought." Roosevelt described the school as a place where constant change was understood at a philosophical level, and thus expected and planned for. But what's jarring is that UNC was steeped in Southern traditions that refused and rejected change, especially reflected in the fact that the university was segregated and refused to admit Black people at the time. After hearing Roosevelt's speech, Pauli Murray promptly took out their typewriter to call him out. For context, Murray was a Durham native whose family had been committed teachers across generations up and down the Atlantic coast. To further their training, Murray applied to UNC's graduate school earlier that year and was immediately rejected on the basis of race. They had firsthand experience with the lack of change for Black people in and around the UNC community and questioned the liberal thoughts and characteristics that the president was assigning to UNC and applauding. Murray wrote to the president in part, quote, "What does this mean for Negro Americans? Does it mean that we, at last, may participate freely and on the basis of equality with our fellow citizens in working out the problems of this democracy? Does it mean that the University of North Carolina is ready to open its doors to Negro students seeking enlightenment on the social and economic problems which the South faces? Does it mean that you are ready to use your prestige and influence to see to it that this step is taken? Or does it mean that everything you said has no meaning for us as Negroes? I appeal for an answer because I and my people are perplexed." How dare the president come to Pauli Murray's part of the world and claim that it was liberal and expansive and evolving when Black people had been struggling and suffering against Southern tradition across generations? And while Murray's words were cutting, the deepest cut, in my opinion, was inflicted at the end of the letter, under their signature line, where they CC'd First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, this is my kind of historic petty. Murray attached a cover letter to Eleanor Roosevelt that opened with a reminder of their first encounter. They wrote, quote, "You do not remember me, but I was the girl who did not stand up when you passed through the social hall of Camp Terra during one of your visits in the winter of 1934-35. Miss Mills criticized me afterward, But I thought and still feel that you are the sort of person who prefers to be accepted as a human being and not a human paragon. I mean, that's the definition of doubling down. Murray closed the cover letter by describing how the letter to the president outlines a problem that millions of Black people face and, quote, "It will not let me or any other thinking Negro rest. Need I say more?" Look, y'all, I'm bold, but wow, this is next level in terms of righteous energy that Murray must have been feeling when they decided to CC the First Lady. And the tone of, "Need I say more?" It reads like, you get it, right? On reflection, decades later, Murray had a big reaction to their choice to involve the First Lady during an interview with Dr. Thomas Sobes in 1978 as part of an oral history about Eleanor Roosevelt. Take a listen to what they had to say.
Today, I'm astounded at my, what shall I call it, chutzpah?
Okay.
You know, I'm standing up to Mrs. Roosevelt. I call it confrontation by typewriter today. And so I wrote this angry letter to the president and then sent a copy to Mrs. Roosevelt. And this was my woman's, quote, intuition or whatever, that you know that those letters will get stuck down the line. They'll never get to the president's desk. But you believe Mrs. Roosevelt will read everything that comes in. And whether she passes it on to the president or not, this gets closer to the president than secretary clerk number 55 down the line.
Well, that intuition was right because Eleanor Roosevelt responded. About 2 weeks after Pauli Murray CC'd Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady responded in part, quote, "I understand perfectly, but great change comes slowly. Sometimes it is better to fight hard with conciliatory methods. The South is changing, but don't push too fast." What a weak response. And Pauli Murray agreed, as they knew that the First Lady did not, in fact, understand perfectly. Murray knew that Roosevelt rejected blatant defiance and preferred smaller gestures, and they offered grace when the First Lady exhibited even the smallest degree of understanding. One of those small gestures happened in 1938 when Eleanor Roosevelt attended the founding meeting of the Southern Conference on Human Welfare in Birmingham, Alabama, alongside Mary McLeod Bethune. During an integrated meeting, local Commissioner Bull Connor and police enforced segregation laws and divided the crowd by race. According to Majeska Simkin, a conference attendee who witnessed the moment, the First Lady called for a chair and a yardstick, measured to the center of the aisle, dividing the Black and white attendees, and sat a chair in the middle of the aisle beside Bethune for the duration of the session. That gesture gave Pauli Murray a sense of possibility, and they saw value in continuing their correspondence with the First Lady because of what she represented. Here's how Murray described it during an interview with Dr. Thomas Sobes in 1978.
To me, she was a representative in the sense of what they would say today as the power structure. And obviously, I had political designs in the sense that if I could convince her of the justice of our case, she in turn would somehow reach the president. And so I was well aware of the role she played in the White House and the importance of having her know our point of view.
Eleanor Roosevelt's gestures and what she represented to Pauli Murray are what fueled their relationship, and soon they started showing up for each other in increasingly more substantive and intentional ways. One of the first examples I learned about how Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt showed up for each other from the FDR Presidential Archives was when the First Lady supported Murray's work with National Sharecroppers Week. Murray joined the staff in 1939 and immediately reached out to the First Lady to support their organizing and advocacy activities in 1940. The tone of the letters they exchanged was casual, and there was an alacrity from the First Lady as she agreed to judge a high school student contest and offer a cash prize for the winners. Roosevelt also agreed to deliver a keynote speech at a dinner for National Sharecroppers Week. The First Lady's support validated the sharecroppers' organizing efforts and offered valuable amplification of the plight that sharecroppers were facing as landowners evicted them from land, and encampments of destitute sharecroppers and their families expanded across the nation. Roosevelt's support also gave Murray incredible sway among organizers and civil rights workers. Not to mention, the invitation to support National Sharecroppers Week facilitated Murray and Roosevelt's next face-to-face meeting in January 1940 at Roosevelt's New York apartment. Patricia Bell Scott described their interaction, along with the 5 other representatives from National Sharecroppers Week, as, quote, Murray had the sense that she was talking with an affectionate older relative. That older relative energy and support continued into another moment when Roosevelt showed up for Pauli Murray about 2 months after their New York City meeting. Murray was traveling to Durham, North Carolina for a quick trip home with a friend via segregated buses, and at a stop in Petersburg, Virginia, the bus driver instructed both of them to move from their seats in the 4th row of the bus. And to be clear, this demand was made in spite of the fact that they were already seated behind the white passengers. After refusing to remove from their seats, the bus driver brought police on board who took their information and drafted warrants, but ultimately left the bus without arresting them. It wasn't until the driver handed out witness cards exclusively to the white passengers and Murray questioned his discriminatory actions that the driver summoned the police again, and Murray and their friend were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct and creating a public disturbance. Before the arrests, Murray strategically asked another passenger going to Durham, North Carolina, to take their information and to contact their aunt if the situation escalated. Like any effective phone tree, word spread quickly and even further than Murray expected.
By that time, my sister knew what had happened. My sister called the White House to inform Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt apparently called the governor of Virginia. And eventually, the jailer knew they had some rather special cargo, so they better treat us decently.
Now that is a flex. And it was one that Murray hadn't anticipated. But it didn't come without scolding. In their memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, Murray included a letter the First Lady's secretary sent to their sister, which read in part, quote, Mrs. Roosevelt had an investigation made after receiving your telegram about your sister. She asked the governor of Virginia about it, which is all she could do, and he says that Miss Murray was unwise not to comply with the law. As long as these laws exist, it does no one much good to violate them. Just when I thought we were getting somewhere. Now, this last sentence just tainted the moment. It would have been great if Eleanor Roosevelt would have ended the note at calling the governor, but her limitation in understanding showed itself again. It's frustrating for me to read that more than 85 years later, and I'm sure Murray was annoyed and upset by it too. For her part, Roosevelt described her friendship with Murray in a personal essay for Ebony magazine in February 1953. The headline printed in bold letters below a photo of Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune seated in chairs, knee-to-knee smiling on the cover of the magazine was, Some of my best friends are Negro. When the essay was reprinted in November 1975, Ebony editors added an editor's note that reads in part, quote, the article reveals a rather naive liberalism that might be scorned today, but was an expression of courage in the early 50s. And I get it, the note was needed because this essay was pretty cringe to read. In the essay, Roosevelt described her dynamic with Murray, writing, quote, one of my finest young friends is a charming woman lawyer, Pauli Murray, who has been quite a firebrand at times, but of whom I am very fond. She is a lovely person who has struggled and come through very well. I think there were times when she might have done foolish things, but now I think she is well ready to be of real use. We know that one of the foolish things Roosevelt is referring to here is Murray's busing arrest. I learned in the archives, though, that there was another letter from Murray that Roosevelt felt was foolish as well. In January 1942, 5 months into Japanese internment during World War II, Pauli Murray wrote to President Roosevelt asking, quote, if Japanese Americans can be evacuated to prevent violence being perpetrated upon them, then certainly you have the power to evacuate Negro citizens from lynching areas in the South. Now, usually I ride with Pauli Murray, but this time I balked at their use of the phrase evacuate to prevent violence because Japanese Americans were unjustly and forcibly removed from their homes and into detention camps, the same way ICE brutalizes people who are immigrants and forces them into detention camps today. 36 years later, Murray expressed that this statement was sarcasm and desperation in response to the failed anti-lynching legislation at the time. Still, as usual, Murray included the First Lady on the letter and CC'd her, and received a response that they hadn't anticipated. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote back to Murray, quote, "For one who must really have a knowledge of the workings of our kind of government, your letter seems to me one of the most thoughtless I have ever read." Roosevelt also included a few justifications and explanations, but all of that paled in comparison to this sharp statement. Naturally, Murray wrote back. And here's how they described it to Dr. Sobes in that 1978 interview.
The impact was such that this opened the door for me to say exactly what I thought. And I wrote her, I must say that I'm embarrassed that that letter is in your files. Not that I didn't mean what I said. I did. But as I recall, I even went on to say that there are times when I doubt that the white man has the capacity to solve this problem.
When they met face to face, Eleanor Roosevelt wrapped Pauli Murray in a hug that they weren't anticipating, completely disarming them.
When I saw Mrs. Roosevelt at that interview, she hugged me and said, we mentioned the Walla case, and she said it was a terrible night, wasn't it, or something. And this just removed all of the anger. You know, we met as two people, a bond of sympathy. We had been through a painful experience together. And I think from that moment on, I began to try to understand where Mrs. Roosevelt was coming from, quote, as the young people say today. And I think she came closer to understanding where I was coming from.
The confrontation via typewriter, as Murray described it, was a critical moment in their relationship. Eleanor Roosevelt seemed to acknowledge that same nuance in her friendships in her personal essay for Ebony magazine, writing, quote, "In friendship, it is necessary to understand your friend's good and bad qualities. It must be a mutual examination of each other, and it must be forgiving and understanding." These two people were bonded. They were connected. And from there on, their letters and exchanges grew more and more personal. There were more invitations to tea, poems that were written, shared, and praised, inquiries about Murray's health and that of her aunts, and the First Lady sent a large floral arrangement to Howard University Law School to celebrate Pauli Murray's graduation, which delighted and embarrassed them. Naturally, there were also still policy debates and advocacy campaigns that they collaborated on through the years, but it is clear that after their confrontation in 1942, the relationship had evolved beyond associates and entered true friendship.
We both admired and had respect for one another, but I was not so overwhelmed by Mrs. Roosevelt that I didn't do what I felt I had to do. And I really think that this is what made our friendship such a great one, that we both respected one another, and I think Mrs. Roosevelt respected me because she felt I was one of the few people who would not snow her, who would tell her right out what I thought. And I felt that I could ask her any question and she would answer honestly. I don't think she ever pulled back on a punch. She was one of the most honest people about herself, about her children, that I ever knew. And this was the basis of the great respect and a growing. You see, it was a growing relationship, a very painful growing relationship.
After President Roosevelt died in 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt left the White House and split her time between her New York City apartment and the family cottage in Hyde Park, New York. She and Murray would meet for tea or dinner once or twice a year and take occasional weekend trips to the Hyde Park cottage. Let's be real, I'm not sure why this is labeled a cottage because it was a factory. One of Eleanor Roosevelt's side hustles was running a furniture factory she had with her friends, and after the business closed, she converted the building into a cottage. One friend described it as having an enormous number of guest rooms of all shapes and sizes, and Roosevelt's secretary had an entire wing to herself that featured her own kitchen, her own bedroom, another guest room, a living room, a porch, and more. So this is not a cottage at all, really. But we'll keep calling it that, just for consistency. Murray described the visits to the cottage in Hyde Park as pilgrimages for renewal of the spirit, and they were intentional about sharing the experience with as many of their relatives and friends as possible. Murray wrote that their greatest thrill was taking their Aunt Pauline and Aunt Sally to Hyde Park in August 1952 for lunch, which Eleanor Roosevelt served to the guest herself, and a personal tour through the Presidential Library. Murray's aunts were so delighted by the experience that they recounted the entire trip in a letter that was circulated among every relative and friend that they had in Durham, North Carolina. Murray also wrote that their fondest recollection was Eleanor Roosevelt's refusal to let a little hurricane disrupt a weekend trip to Hyde Park with Murray and their niece in October 1954. The hurricane prompted an electrical and water outage, and when it was time to bathe, Eleanor Roosevelt rubbed soap all over herself and bathed in the neighbor's pool. Of course, the neighbor was one of her own family members. Roosevelt then encouraged Murray and their niece to do the same, appearing at their door wearing her robe and a towel turban on her head. Not only was the First Lady skinny dipping at 70 years old, but she was inviting her guests to do the same. It should be noted, though, it was October in upstate New York. Murray was hesitant to put on their robe and went to the pool, but just as they worked up the courage to dip a toe into the pool, a delivery man arrived and they scampered back to the house, and thankfully, the water had been restored. Somehow this pool bathing scenario captures the tone of their friendship journey, their sisterhood. It started with a seemingly outlandish action. Then there was nudging and listening, a bit of a testing of boundaries on both sides, and ultimately, we have well-timed resolution that works for everyone involved. Before we close out this episode, I want to share some of the research that nearly got left on the cutting room floor. It's time for my favorite segment, One Last Nugget. Given the range of Pauli Murray's talents and experiences, I believe that they were perpetually ahead of their time, and that gave them space to explore areas others hadn't yet considered. One example of that is in 1944, when Murray wrote a paper at Howard Law School proposing the legal approach to effectively challenging Plessy versus Ferguson by emphasizing the unequal facilities on a case-by-case basis and the resulting inferior social and legal standing and effects that Black people experienced. Their classmates laughed and said it was too visionary. One professor even bet $10 against the approach ever working. Still, Murray pressed on. And while there was no legal precedent to back up their theory, they relied on social and psychological data. Ultimately, Murray's approach was at the core of the Supreme Court argument presented by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team in Brown v. Board. Surprisingly, Murray wasn't told about how they influenced the case until 10 years after the Supreme Court decision was issued. Plus, Pauli Murray was not a one-hit wonder with their fresh legal approaches. They also developed the approach to confronting discrimination on the basis of sex and the 14th Amendment as the primary constitutional recommendation from the Presidential Commission on the State of Women. Murray argued that the Equal Protection Clause named any person, and that courts were overdue to re-examine state laws and policies as the Supreme Court hadn't reconsidered this issue since 1908. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg referred to this memo and strategy when she argued Reed versus Reed before the Supreme Court in 1971. And Ginsburg credited Pauli Murray as a co-author in recognition of the influence of their perspective and recommendation from that Commission on the State of Women. All in all, Pauli Murray was a genius and a badass. Thank you for listening to Archival. At the start of the episode, I told y'all this would be a journey, and was I right or was I right? Now, I want to know what you think. Send me your reactions to this story and your hot takes about the show at juanitatoliver.com/contact. I've added a link to the show notes to make it easy for you. If you enjoyed this episode of Archival, subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Archival is a production of J. Tolliver Media, LLC.